Welcome to the Shameless Podcast, where I help Christian men kill shame, stand strong, and live on mission. I'm your host, Ken Freire, and I'm bringing you real stories, practical insights, and biblical truths that equip you to break free from your sin, shame, and live a life of purpose. Let's step out of the shadows together and into the light of Christ. Everybody, welcome back to the Shameless Podcast. Today, I have with me lead pastor of the Bridge Church here in Spring Hill, Tennessee, Ian Simkins, and he's been a lead pastor since 2010. So Ian, you have massive amounts of experience with men. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Of course, man. I'm honored to be invited. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Well, today we're having a fantastic conversation. And the topic that we're going to talk about is helping men find their God-given purpose as a means to overcome their distractions and their sins, and specifically this sin of pornography that we talk about in lust. My first question to you, actually, before we get to do a massive deep dive, is tell us something fun about yourself that most people wouldn't know if they just met you on the street.
Sure. I'm the oldest of 7 kids outside of Detroit, Michigan. But something that I learned early on is that all of my uncles rode the unicycle. And so they taught most all of us. And I have a ton of cousins. So there's probably realistically maybe 25 of us on my mom's side of the family that can ride the unicycle. And every year for our family reunion, we would gather and we'd play unicycle hockey together. And that's not a story that I can usually weave in naturally in conversation. And I think people might be surprised to learn that.
Okay, so if I ever see someone randomly driving a unicycle or riding a unicycle here in Spring Hill, I'll just assume it's you.
The chances are really good that it's me. Absolutely.
How often do you get a chance to ride your unicycle?
Bro, I haven't ridden so long. I know where it is. My brother and I, we used to ride around town like it was our bicycle. We just found so much joy in like seeing people's dumbfounded reactions. But it's not super practical. It's really uncomfortable. You can only do it for so long. So I don't even know. It's been a long time since I've ridden it.
Yeah. And I'm sure it's kind of like riding a bicycle that you can get it on it pretty quickly and it's just like muscle memory.
Boy, maybe. I'm too nervous to try, to be honest. The way that my uncle taught me, he's like, you basically just fall forward the whole time and then pedal to catch up with yourself. And I'm like, that's a pretty terrifying proposition, which maybe would explain why a lot of people don't do it.
Yeah. You know, as soon as you said that, my heart just started racing because I was like, I'm going to face plant and eat it the whole time.
Well, that's what the unicycle hockey thing was so unwise, because the unicycles are already kind of treacherous. And then you give everyone a long wooden stick. Like a stick and a spoke of unicycle means there's just bodies flying everywhere. Someone was always getting a bloody nose or dislocating their arm or whatever. And we thought that was amazing.
Yeah, you're like, this is the best thing ever.
Of course.
You should bring it back the next family reunion.
I'll work on it. I'll get unicycle ready.
Exactly. Okay, well, that is not the conversation we're having today, but that was a fun one. You're going to have to weave it into a sermon at some point.
Sure, I'll work on it.
But we're going to talk about helping men find their God-given purpose. And I think the biggest thing in your experience now, why do you think that this is such a pervasive struggle amongst men, even within the church?
Yeah, I think the idea of purpose has certainly gotten co-opted by a lot of other parodies. And I think part of what, in my limited experience, I think when we lack purpose, we distract with pleasure. And not that I think, I'm not a masochist. I don't think pleasure is wrong. But I do think when we don't have some kind of vision for our lives and who we are in Christ and what that actually means as, a husband or a father, if you are one, I think without that, it's an old analogy, but the boiling of a frog, it's just that slow cranking up of the heat that you don't really realize until you've blinked and 20 years have passed. And you're like, oh, I haven't chased after anything. I haven't fought for anything. And that's always, to me, that needs to be held in tension, because there are very few times in the New Testament that it says that we are to be ambitious. And the couple of times that it does, it says things like, make it your ambition to live a quiet life. So that kind of instruction does sort of fly in the face sometimes of our like reach for the stars, change the world. So that's not what I mean when I mean by purpose. I think sometimes we hold up like the inventors of great technology or the curers of great diseases or whatever. I think purpose has a lot more to do with living life intentionally. Like, who was mine to love and care for and shepherd, and to do that with intention. Like Annie Dillard says, how we live our days is how we live our lives.
Hmm.
I think a lot of men in particular sometimes desire big, grand, romantic or heroic acts, but we fail in the like subtle, mundane, like the easily overlooked stuff. You know, my buddy's got a sign over his kitchen sink and it says, everyone wants a revolution. No one wants to do the dishes. I find men in particular struggle in that space. Like we all kind of at some point will fantasize about doing something remarkable, but we're maybe missing like the quiet, patient, mundane, common ways that God has right before us to live out our purpose. You know, I think it's Catcher in the Rye. J.D. Salinger says the mark of an immature man is that he wants to die nobly for a cause, but the mark of a mature man is that he wants to live humbly for one.
Hmm.
I think there's a lot of wisdom in that, particularly when it comes to like unpacking and engaging with our purpose. I think it often looks much more mundane than we realize.
Yeah. It's interesting. I had a friend who used to tell me a lot of us men, we have that heroic instinct inside of us that we want to die for something great, but we're
Right.
not willing to die daily.
Hmm.
You know, like
Totally.
die daily to our struggles, die daily to our sin, but at the same time, like die daily to the distractions that we have so that we could actually focus on the purposeful things. I love how you said it, like intentionality to loving one another and the people around us.
Totally. And I think that is we've seen examples of this. I actually just read this in a book yesterday. Where it was a story of somebody who actually ended up doing something really heroic, but 6 days prior, had sent an email to a friend of his that was kind of despondent. Like, I guess I'm gonna have to come to terms with the fact that I'm never going to do anything heroic.
Hmm.
But the person that was sharing the story saying, but he was a man who lived by a code. Like he knew who he, in the mundane, in the ordinary, and that's actually what prepared him to step into heroic action when the moment. Like I think we imagine that like we'll become heroes when the need arises, but we're actually not like living the kinds of lives formationally that would even make us prepared to step into action or to whatever the situation would demand. And it was such a compelling example of a guy who like had purpose, was actually a little sad that he didn't feel like he was ever going to get a chance to display it, to share that, but still lived by this code. And then less than a week later had this opportunity to, and it cost him his life, but it saved thousands others. Like it was just this
Wow.
really remarkable picture of how backwards I think we sometimes get it.
Yeah. So talk to us about like guys who they do struggle, right? Because they're like, I want to live a heroic life,
Hmm.
but they hate the mundane, and that mundane leads them to distractions and sinful habits.
Sure. That's a big question, man. Um, I think so. Brother Lawrence wrote a book called "The Practice of the Presence of God," and
Great book.
his kind of aim, his thesis is, the aim of the Christ follower is to live in two places at once, doing the dishes and in the presence of God, driving to work and in the presence of God, um, doing the gardening and in the presence of God. And I think we often lack awareness of God's presence even in the mundane, and that's what makes it so unbearable for so many of us. Is because we're so dopamine addicted. We're such a microwave culture. We want things instantly, fast, right away. In my experience, it's often in the desert seasons that God does his best work. It's like it's in the wilderness that the roots go down deepest. And yet, most of us, if left to our own devices, we want nothing to do with the wilderness or the mundane. We want up and to the right, and we want exciting, and we want fulfillment. And I just think the crucible of formation is actually in the mundane moments of every day. So it's a little cliche, but I like to say that public fruit grows from private formation. If there's anybody that you look to as like a spiritual hero or a titan or whatever, I guarantee you, whatever publicly whatever you admire about their public life, there are hours of private things, private decisions that we'll never see or never know. And yet I feel like we sort of elevate and celebrate the success that this platform or this dollar amount or whatever. And so we try to curse the ordinary in pursuit of that, not realizing like, man, what ultimately got that person there likely was actually a series of very small decisions compounded over 20 years, or that formed them into the kind of person. Formation is way more crock pot than microwave.
Yeah.
You can microwave a stew if you want. It's not going to be nearly as good though. And so, we want these faster, and we fall into it all the time, and pastors are not immune. I get emails all the time. They're like, quadruple your church attendance in 48 hours. I'm like, I don't think it's supposed to work like that, actually. Maybe sometimes,
Yeah.
but by and large, I think it's much more slow burn. So I think if we can learn to like reclaim the ordinary as sacred space, not just when the endorphins are high or when the song crescendos or at the spiritual retreat. And all those things are good, by the way. Like those are all like physiological. I think that's how we're made by design. But to reclaim this the sacred sense of the ordinary, I think has I don't know. It's the question of like, Lord, what are you doing even in this moment? We tend to assume that like God only moves. It's the story of Elijah, right? He wasn't in the fire or the wind. He was actually in the still small voice. And that for a lot of men in particular is the thing that I think we're running from. Any kind of stillness, any kind of silence, any kind of rest of any kind. And yet we're surprised that when we live like that we don't hear from God.
Yeah. And what's crazy is that when I think about us running away from the still small voice, we think we're going to run to somewhere neutral. But what ends up happening, we run to something more sinful
That's right.
most of the time. And you're like,
Yes,
what just happened? It's because
that's
God
right.
wanted to speak to us back then, but we got scared.
That's
And,
right.
I was just talking to a friend who was like, I hate sitting in
Hmm.
quiet time. Like,
Sure.
it freaks me out. They're like, I need to be busy all the time. And I'm like, why? And they're like, oh, it's just like, if I feel like I sit down, I'm not good enough. And I'm
Hmm.
like, when are you going to let God actually just speak to you in those moments?
Yes.
And they were like, I don't think I could do that. I'm like,
Well,
oh, that's,
I think it's even more ontological than that. I think that is, and I can totally relate to that, by the way. I am not good at sitting still. I have that same productivity itch. I had a mentor years ago that really lovingly pulled me aside one day and he said, Ian, does your pace of life look like that of someone who actually wants to hear from God? And he
mm,
didn't even need to tell me the answer. I knew the answer, but he presented it as a question. But part of what I realized is it's not just because you can be legalistic about it, like
yeah,
carve out stillness time, and sometimes that's necessary. Sometimes that's even good. But if I zoom back even further, and I think Henry Nouwen talks about this, he says one of the greatest things that we can commit our life to is leading from a place of belovedness, that you are the beloved in Christ, even when you accomplish nothing, even when you
mm,
fall flat on your face. And I think until we can actually like truly rest in that as our identity, rest will always feel like stress if busyness is your drug. If that is the thing that you are using to either self medicate or fulfill some sense of importance, like rest will always feel like stress because you're currently addicted to a completely different posture of life. And until you actually get at why am I actually addicted to constant activity, constant noise, constant production? Man, until you actually unpack the why, you'll just fill it with a different vice.
yeah. Back in 2020, a lot of us were going through a little something, something here,
Uh-huh.
right?
Yeah.
But I actually got really sick. And what I
Mhm.
didn't realize is that I had burnt out, like adrenal fatigue. There was a bunch of stuff that ended up happening. And my doctor was like, you need to slow down your life so
Mhm.
much that it has to look completely different. She's like, you can't get elevated stress. You can't even get super excited. I had to become stoic. And I'm like,
Wow.
that sounds so weird because I'm very driven. I'm going to go 100 miles an hour. I'm doing a ton of stuff. I had a lot of stuff on my plate.
Right.
And she's like, no, you can't even do that. She's like, Ken, you can't even go watch a movie that might spike your adrenaline.
No kidding.
Yeah, she's like, you just got to go watch Anna Green Gables. I'm like, I'm going to die of boredom. And going back to purpose, right? I was like, that sounds like the most useless, wasteful, purposeless life I could have ever lived. And she's
Yes.
like, but that's because you don't know how to slow down.
Right.
And it took 8 months for me to all of a sudden realize how much I was burning both ends of the
Mhm.
wick. And I was like, what
Mhm.
have I been doing my whole life that I've just been going nonstop? And I
Right.
still have those tendencies. I still, like, if I'm
Sure.
not mindful, I'm like, oh, let's just keep doing it.
Totally.
So, like, I am one of those people that is very ambitious.
Same.
How do you help men like that who are ambitious and that ambition actually is driving them away from their purpose?
Oh man. Great question. I don't think God is anti-ambition, to be honest. I don't think the answer to toxic ambition is sloth. I don't think that's
Yeah.
the like you just need to go get a hut on an island and live out your days on the beach. I don't think that's the answer. I did have a friend say, time off won't heal you if the problem is how you spend time on. And I
Hmm.
thought that that was pretty apt because I'm like you, where I was really good at an early age at like guarding Sabbath. I was pretty militant about it, but I was killing myself 6 days out of the week, collapsing for one, and then just doing it all over again. And I had a buddy kind of pull me aside and he's like, "Hey, I honor you for your commitment to Sabbath, but the rest of your life still feels like chaos. I don't know that
Hmm.
that's the point of Sabbath rest." So I didn't actually address the ambition piece. I just like militantly, legalistically held on to this idea of a 24-hour period of rest. So that didn't fix it the way that I had thought it would. And I realized so much of my ambition was aimed to try to either quiet a voice or counteract a narrative. And I don't know where this comes from, man. Maybe you can relate to this. Somewhere along the line of my early adulthood, I bought the lie that I am only as valuable as what I can produce. Like
Yeah.
that just embedded itself so clearly. And what's ironic is that at the same time, I'm preaching sermons that are against that. And yet internally still believing, man, if you're not producing, if you're not achieving, if you're not so I needed to surround myself with people who would like speak life and truth back into me. This wasn't something I was going to think my way out of. I tried that path, like, oh, I just need to think better thoughts. That'll cure this. I like realized, and that was pretty hard for me to admit. I was like, I need people more than I realized, like gospel community to speak the truth of my identity over me when I was pursuing all these other things to try and fulfill it. And that was harder for me than I thought it would be. I thought I could just sort of come up with my own game plan, implement, and then be healthier. And I don't know. I was just compelled by, like, in the New Testament, there's something like 59 one another's. Just like
Yeah.
there's over and over and over again these examples like you were not meant to try and traverse this road on your own. And I, for so long, just assumed I was the exception. I was like, you maybe need people, but I think I got this. I think and unfortunately, I'm one of those guys that kind of has to fall flat on his face a few times before I get the message.
Hmm.
I wish I was one of those like repent early and often, yes, Lord, whatever you say. And I'm more like, God needs to like pin me to the mat before I'm like, okay, all right,
You,
yeah,
you tripped over your own foot, and
I
then he's
got it.
like, hey.
I don't like that about me, but it's part of how I'm wired, I think. So yeah, inviting people into that struggle was one of the healthiest things I think I've ever done.
Yeah. It's interesting that most people that I've ever talked to have never, I don't think, and even myself, as we talk about this, I don't know if I've ever talked intentionally with someone about helping me through my performance struggle, right?
Hmm.
Like in an accountability sense of things. I've had
Yeah,
mentors speak into it. I'm looking for rest, but to truly be like, hey guys, I have a performance struggle that I'm like, my identity is wrapped in my performance and I need
totally,
help for Sabbath. I don't think
totally.
I've ever heard that in a small group.
Well, and that's what's kind of dark, to be honest, man, because we live in a time where alcoholics get treatment, but workaholics get applause. Like that's part of what drove me to it so early on. I was like, okay, I'm getting a lot of accolades when I put in 13-hour days and when I say yes to every request. And when you know what I mean? Like there's a lot of cheerleaders on the road to workaholism and burnout. And so to ask for accountability for it, for a lot of people, it's like, why? That's not a sin. Like, why would you ask for accountability about a porn addiction or substance abuse or whatever, but not performance? And I think it was Rich Velotis who said when he took over for Pete Scazzero in New York, the legend is that Pete said, there's one thing you can do that'll get you fired from this job. And Rich was like, what is it? And he goes, if you don't take a Sabbath. He talks about how that was not at all what he expected the answer to be. And he says, if you don't commit to taking a regular rhythm of rest, you will not have the depth that you will need to draw from in order to lead a church effectively. And I just thought that was really wise. Like someone bluntly saying, oh no, I'll fire you for this. If you don't prioritize this, you will do harm to yourself and others. And I won't. It's the first time I'd ever heard a pastor be that firm on it. And I think honestly, there's some real wisdom to that.
Yeah. Well, man, I think that our church culture desperately needs that. If you think about just you and I talking about our tendency to hustle,
Right.
most churches and pastors are burning out. They're stressed out. They're working 50 plus hours a week. I talk to a lot of pastors and ministry leaders who come to me for my job at Full Focus, and they're just like, I am exhausted. I cannot stop. And I'm like, you need to slow down. And they're like, I have no idea how to slow down. And it's this constant hustle culture that our society loves. And it's actually infiltrated our churches and also individuals now, because that's what they think performance should look like, is hustle. And then I think also with purpose, they think, oh, I need to hustle in order to achieve my purpose.
Totally. And I don't want to put too much stock in this, but I was thinking about this when I came to the Bridge and we were, sort of rethinking about our mission, vision, values type stuff, kind of looking at a lot of other churches, slogans or mission statements, and realizing how many of them begin either with a verb or an adverb. Like it begins first with action, with doing. And
yeah.
I think most of that's really well intended, but I'm like, oh man, I wonder if this is part of it. Like even in our language, like what are we about as a church? Doing. And I'm like, yes, that's part of it. We are on mission. We are sent people. But man, mission is fueled by presence. And if we skip over presence and go right to mission, it's like a tree with no root system. Like it'll grow some branches and maybe some leaves, but eventually it'll topple beneath the weight. And I think even, to your point, even in how pastors model it, like this is really embarrassing, man, but I had to really come to terms with the fact that for much of my life, I wasn't even trying to be less busy because busyness meant that I felt important. I liked if someone looked over my shoulder and saw how full my calendar was. There's a little part of my brain that's like, yeah, I feel affirmed in that. If our leaders are setting the pace and the tone for our churches and the pace is unsustainable, we can't be all that surprised if people follow suit,
Yeah. And that's where I found that for a lot of guys, when I've worked with them, when their ambition takes them too far and they're burning out, they fall into so much sexual sin because they're like, I need to medicate. I need to cope. I need to figure things out.
That's right.
But you said something, man, interesting, that like presence, right? You talked about presence dictates like your fruitfulness. And you've said it a few times now where you're like thinking about Brother Lawrence practicing the presence of God and now talking about presence. How does presence help people, especially men, figure out their purpose?
Yeah, so many examples in scripture. Like the simple distillation that I like to use is, when Jesus says, come follow me and I will make you fishers of men. There are really three significant moves. And that's sort of how we've organized ourselves as a church. Come follow me is an invitation to presence. Just come be with me. And then he says, and I will make you. So there's a formation piece. You spend enough time with Jesus, you don't stay the same. He's going to chip away at some stuff. There's a transformation that happens. Fishers of men. You're going to be a sent person. I'm going to send you back out to do what I'm doing. But I think the order is significant. Jesus never says, go for me before he says, be with me. And I think when he talks about like the sheep knowing the voice of the shepherd, you don't get to know someone's voice without spending time with them. Like Jesus seems to be really, really interested that we are very familiar with the shepherd's voice. And yet, for some reason, we think that doesn't actually translate to spending any real time with him. And we know that doesn't work at a human level. Like, this is my best friend, Steve. Like, well, when was the last time you saw Steve? And you're like, 1987. You're like, maybe not. Maybe. And, that's a different, I just think intimacy requires intentionality. And if the goal isn't just to do things for God, but do them with God, I mean, that's the rebuke in Revelation 2, right?
Oh yeah.
Where he's saying, hey, and it's actually, I think it's a bit of a word for today's climate, because he begins first with accolades. He's like, hey, I see all the good work you're doing. And he kind of goes on this list, like offering real encouragement.
Genuine, like, yeah.
Genuine, you guys are crushing it here. Way to go. But I do hold this one thing against you. You have left your first love. Jesus seems to take it really seriously when we do things for him, but not with him. And I just think in my own life, man, those, if I look back over my shoulder, those are often the seasons that I was the most unhealthy, when I was doing good Jesus-y church type things, but I knew deep down I was doing a whole lot more for Jesus than I was doing with him. And bro, I mean, I think you'll agree with this. Activity is a terrible trade-off for intimacy. And they
Yeah.
often look the same, but it is not an equal trade. And I unfortunately have made that trade far too many times in my life. And I think that men in particular can fall into that a lot.
Well, why do you feel like men fall into that? Because I think when I talk to men, men struggle with intimacy. So
Sure.
they try to find a replacement, and it's activity. They're like, well, I'm doing all
Yeah,
these things, right? With their marriages, they do it. They're like, oh, yeah, I did all these things for my wife. I'm
yeah,
supporting her. But she's like, no, no, I want you to be with me. And we
I
take
know,
that same thing with our relationship with God.
I know.
So why do you feel like that is?
Well, and let me just first say, I don't think it's all bad either.
Yeah.
Somebody made some comment the other day. I don't know who said it first, but they said, by and large, women tend to connect face to face, and men connect shoulder to shoulder. I think there's some wisdom to that. Face to face, like over a meal or something like that. Men, and again, obviously, these are
Generalization. Yeah.
generalizations for sure, but I think that there can be intimacy found in inactivity. I don't think the goal is to become a monk and just sit in silence on the top of a mountain. I don't think that's the aim at all. But I do think, for a myriad of reasons, I think often there's an undealt with father wound. I think it is undealt with rejection or fear. That if I actually allow myself to be fully known, if I'm supposed to be the protector, the provider, the stoic, never let them see a sweat, well, if I let my guard down, then I'm going to lose respect from the people I'm leading, or they won't trust my instincts, or what, those are often the lies that I think that I believed. But I also think, like in a marriage example, doing things for is often easier than doing things with. I personally, I like planning big, grandiose, romantic gestures. I do that, but that's not always what my wife needs. And she's like, "Yeah, thank you for the horse-drawn carriage. I actually just need someone to listen to me right now. I had a really rough day, and I don't need all of it. I just need you." And it's taken me a lot longer to learn that than I realized. But I also think, like David Augsburger has this line where he says, being listened to is so close to being loved that for the average person, they're almost indistinguishable. So
That's good.
I'll ask men, I'll say, when was the last time that you felt really loved? And when they describe it, I'll usually say something like, yeah, that sounds a lot like presence. That sounds a lot like intimacy. So if that's how you received that, why are we so unwilling to pursue that with our relationships going forward? And that, I think that is sometimes helpful to kind of juxtapose it with, the times that we felt really seen and known and loved. And easier said than done, though, man. There's a lot of layers to it.
Yeah. And when you think about that layer, right, what would you say for those guys who are, say, struggling with
Yeah,
presence? What would be a
yeah,
good first layer to overcome and steps to take to be like, all right, I want to pursue intimacy?
sure. Yeah, I mean, I think there's been a lot that's been written like in the habit space, like James Clear and some of those writers have, I think, provided some really helpful resources. Honestly, I would start really small. Like the amount of people who have their phone right next to their bed, and it's the last thing they look at every night and the first thing they look at every morning.
Like,
Listen, no judgment, no judgment. That's not even a moral thing. I just think, man, if someone was telling me, man, I struggle to be really present, and I'm like, is your phone the first and last thing you look at every day? that might be contributing to some of our either our distractibility or like what narrative has the loudest voice in our life. If it's social media, that is not leading to your flourishing. I can say that with
Yeah.
confidence. Like sometimes it's something as simple as begin by plugging your phone in somewhere else in the house. Just start there. It doesn't have to begin with 2 hours of meditation every morning. And you know what I mean? For some people that works. For most of us though, it's like, what if you one day a week didn't listen to anything in your car on your commute to work and you just talked with God? You're already in the car. You don't have to even carve out any additional time. What if you just took one commute one day a week? Like, this is my time just to be with God. I'm not going to turn on the radio or a podcast or make phone calls. Like, those decisions are things that are within most all of our power that don't require a Bible degree or $1,000 worth of tech. You can just, you know what I mean? There's these simple choices that I think we all can make if it's something that we want to pursue with more intentionality.
Yeah. Those are great tips that I think about when looking at how do you help men become more intimate and just practical, right? Because sometimes they're just like, I don't know what this looks like. Uh,
Mm,
I found a lot of times guys, especially they were more rugged and tough.
yeah.
When you talk about being intimate with God, that sounds weird, you know?
Yeah.
But when you're like, no, man, you just want to hear his voice. Like, how do you
Right.
hear his voice? You do these things. And once you do that, he actually starts speaking to you about your purpose
That's right.
and what you're supposed to be doing. And I love how you said, like, and this is actually part of the Bridges mission, right? Like, you're going to be with God and then you're
Mhm.
going to do things for God, right? Or for the sake of the world, I think is the way you
Yeah.
guys put it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
When you guys think about it that way, right? How do you help men to figure out their purpose? And especially when men think that their purpose should be like this heroic thing, like day to
Mm.
day, life on life, how should they figure out their purpose?
Man, a couple of things I'll say. One is going to be pretty unpopular. I don't think purpose is nearly as specific as a lot of us make it. I think we want this lightning bolt, bullseye. What position am I supposed to hold in what company, in what city, in what state? I actually don't know
Yeah.
that it works like that for most people. Maybe sometimes. I think it's much more what are the things we already know that Jesus has told us to do? The Great Commission, the Great Commandment, John 17, like the unity of his church. Like there's things already that most of us aren't doing that, like in my own life, I often try to distract from my lack of obedience by asking for new insight, new revelation. And I think it was Marshall McLuhan. He said that many of us have a low information to action ratio because we're taking in more information than our brains can even handle. You know, all of the world's tragedies, all the world's drama, whatever, and it's making us completely inactive in like whatever space that we've been placed in charge of. So I think purpose for most of us is far less, how do I take this job or this job? Do I move to this city or this city? It's like, man, am I loving the Lord my God with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength, loving my neighbors, myself? And am I taking steps to preach the gospel, to share the gospel, to make disciples, to baptize in the name of Jesus? Like those are the things that he was clear on. And I think it was Augustine who said something. He said something like, "Love the Lord and do as you please." Like give him your heart,
Yeah.
and then the sandbox is pretty big. And that might be as a mechanic or a business owner or a graphic designer, or like I think that there's provision for a lot of that. And purpose, Frederick Buechner, he talks about it under the language of vocation, but I think it applies. He talks about vocation as the place where your great joy and the world's great need overlap. And I come back to that as a Venn diagram a lot. Like, okay, what is that? What's the thing that like stirs my heart for God and others? And I can see, at least in my tiny corner of the universe, like, oh, I think there's an actual need for this. That's been a helpful way to kind of think through, and it's been helpful for other men because I don't think everyone. Sometimes people will say to me as a pastor, oh, "I want to quit my job and go into ministry," and I always want to tell them, "What if I told you you're already in ministry? Like
Yeah.
if you are in Jesus." At this job and in this neighborhood, you're having conversations with people that I'll never have conversations with that may never actually show up to church, but you have an opportunity to redeem this work environment or this neighborhood to bring the kingdom of God from heaven to earth. That's the invitation, the charge that we're given. And so I think purpose is a lot less about this granular, oh, this decision or that decision, and more about, man, what has Jesus already invited us into? And how can I, with a community of other men or other people, begin to take steps faithfully in that direction? You know, we talk about small groups at our church all the time because I believe in them. I think that that is where transformation is found. I love preaching. I can't believe that I get to do it. Like, it's one of the great joys of my life. But I don't think the bulk of transformation happens from listening to sermons. I think it happens in the context of relationship and walking it out. And so, yeah, I think a man trying to find purpose in isolation is, at the very least, not the wisest methodology in the world.
Yeah, it's not helpful. Going back to what you were saying earlier, it's like the one another, right? Of like,
Exactly.
if in order to overcome performance, you need one another. How much more do you need one another to help you, one, see what you're supposed to do with your purpose, and two,
Oh,
actually living
totally.
out that purpose?
Totally. I mean, that is the, again, you know, I'm a Jesus guy, so I'll keep pointing back to that. But there's so many examples in the New Testament where, like, villages were begging Jesus to stay just a little bit longer, perform one more miracle, and he's regularly retreating from the very legitimate demands of the people to say, no, I have to, I need to be with the Father. Like, I need to go be. So, like, there's this very real, like, for a people pleaser like me, you know, that can be really hard to do. Like, well, their needs are real. I can actually help with this, but I'm not guarding my intimacy at all. Like, it has to be a both and to be in relationship with one another. Like, God is himself relationship, Father, Son, and Spirit. And so if we're made in the image and likeness of a God who ontologically is relationship, why would we think that flourishing for our lives would come apart from that? Like, I just, to me, it feels so, like, he makes it so clear. And yet in our hyper individualized, isolated, siloed tendencies, you know, I think many of us think that we're the exception. And the other thing I'll say about community too, because I'm certainly sympathetic to the person that they joined a small group or like a recovery group or whatever, and they didn't jive and it wasn't like a great fit. And they're like, you know what? Forget this. I knew this was whack. Uh, I think that there's space for that, but I also think community, like gospel community, is way more forged than found. I don't think you just like trip on it. You're like, oh, I found it. This is my perfect community. I think it's like a thing that, you know, you got to kind of work on and fight for a little bit. There's no perfect marriage. You got to work on it, and not just on your anniversaries. Like, it is a, you know what I mean? It's what you were saying. It's a daily dying to self. It's a daily, not my will, but yours be done. It's a taking up my cross. It is looking not to my interest, but the interests of others. Like, these are not things that I don't think we ever graduate from any of them. But by God's grace, like a muscle, they get stronger the more that we do it. So in my own life, sins that 10 years ago were like a knockdown, drag out fight anytime I was tempted, it's not that they're not tempting anymore, but it's not that same UFC level bloody nose battle. It's just like, I
Yeah.
know. Yeah, I don't go down that route anymore. I don't even turn down that street. Like, my muscle memory points in a different direction now. That's the nature, that's the language of transformation. And I think that's the aim for all of us.
Yeah. I'm reminded of everything you just said reminds me of Romans 12, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
offer yourself up as a living sacrifice
Yes.
for the renewing of your mind so that this will be honorable and pleasing to God. And I'm like, that's exactly it. And the
Totally.
more you do that, the more you find yourself being with God and doing things for God.
Mm.
Those two things end up happening. Ian, as we start to wrap up this conversation, and I feel like you and I could just talk for hours, and even if this thing was recorded, we're like, oh, we forgot. Talk about unicycles again. Oh, sorry, I was about to go on a total tangent there, but I'm
I
going to
can
bring
feel
it
it.
back. I was like, I'm bringing it back. As you think about helping men, I know that there's a lot of myths that you kind of busted. Like, even I was thinking about sometimes you feel disconnected with your job because you just feel like you have to pay the bills. But you said something really important. You're like, but there are ministry moments there, right? How can you help men, as we wrap up here, really focus their attention so that they can see every moment of their day being purposeful for the
Mm-hmm.
Great Commission, purposeful for being with God, and ultimately purposeful for loving those around them?
Great question, man. A couple of things. You mentioned Romans 12. I had a mentor that used to say to us, He said that's the problem with the living sacrifice, is that they have a tendency to climb off the altar.
Yeah.
And I just think that imagery is so apt because, in a sacrificial system, not to be crass, but like you would sacrifice an animal and then it's not going anywhere. If our invitation is to be a living sacrifice, that means we don't just surrender once back at church camp and we're good. So there is like a daily dying to self that I think we are invited into, that can be a real struggle, because some of the stuff that I think Jesus is asking us to die to, we don't want to die to. I think men in particular, I think we have a tendency sometimes to tame what the Bible says to put to death. Like we keep pet sins over here. Like, yeah, I don't plan on going there, but I'm going to keep for a rainy day, maybe. Like, now the language of the Bible is, the Puritans give us the language of mortification, like put to death these sinful desires. That's intense language on purpose. Don't manage it. Don't teach it to do tricks. Put it to death. The other thing I would say is that I think it honestly begins with like a level of expectation that maybe a lot of us are uncomfortable with. Like, it sounds silly, man, but I started even certain like prayer rituals in my car. Like, Lord, just give me eyes to see with your eyes. Like, help me to have radars up, help me to have a sense of what it is that you want to do when I'm at this coffee shop, when I really need heads down work, but there's someone in my peripheral that I have this nagging sense like, man, I think I'm supposed to go talk to this person. Like, soften my heart for those moments, because, and I think you'll agree with this, what's lacking is never God's presence. We are always in God's presence. What's often lacking is our awareness of it. So my prayer has become not, Lord, be more present in this moment. It's shifted, and it's, Lord, make me more aware of your presence in this moment. You're already here. You are already doing work. You are already stirring in these conversations, and the guy in the cubicle to my right and the neighbor behind me. Like, my buddy Hugh talks about it as, he says, kingdom work is like archaeology. We are always unearthing, God, where are you already at work in this guy's marriage and in that conversation and in this teller and this waiter and this, you know what I mean? That to me is a much more compelling invitation. It's not, okay, men, now go and like make kingdom things happen. Go and generate spirit sanctified. It's like, no. It's, Lord, where are you already at work? And help me to understand how I can join you in that. It's like, in a pretty beautiful way, it takes the pressure off of us to like manufacture something, but it's also a posture of readiness. Like, okay, help me to have radars up, help me to see with your eyes, and help me to have the courage to actually step into that. And I'll warn anyone listening, be sure you actually want to pray that prayer, because God will open your eyes to things and make you more aware of people in a way that sometimes, to be totally frank, does not fit nicely into my calendar or my plan for the day, and it disrupts some things, but it's like such a beautiful way. It's like the kind of thing, once you get a sense of it, you're like, Lord, I want deeper waters. I just want to keep growing in this capacity to understand where it is that you're at work and how I can join you in it. And I think that's what's been helpful for me in kind of reclaiming the sacred ordinary of what most of us are not living on mountaintop moments all the time. Most of us are commuting and paying our bills and having dinner and watching Netflix. You know what I mean? There's just a certain level of like, Lord, help me to have a more kingdom perspective for all of it. And I think that he gives it that.
And, I love that aspect of when you have your eyes opened to doing those
Yeah.
things, how radically people's lives. I know when I started doing that, man, I feel like my purpose completely shifted, because I just started looking for those people that I'm like, ooh, who does God want me to speak to today? And it actually drove me, like you said earlier, like it's the day-to-day actions that you do to help me uncover more of what I really wanted to do with life.
That's right. Totally.
I don't need to quit my job. I don't need to all of a sudden be like, oh my gosh, I'm doing this big thing. You're like, you can still be the CEO.
Right.
I can't tell you how many times I have conversations at my job. It's not a faith-based company or anything like that, but people come to me and I just feel like the Lord all of a sudden is like, hey, you need to bring this up. I'm like, okay. I am on a sales call right now.
Yeah.
And then I do. Ian, I can't tell you. And I say this for those who are listening as an encouragement, that when you start to do it, how much more exciting your job gets, because it no
Totally.
longer becomes mundane. You actually feel like you're on mission, cultivating and discovering those little bits and pieces of where God is moving. Because for me, man, there are times God just drops something on my heart for someone. I'm like, I know this sounds crazy. And again, I'm on a sales call. Like, I know this sounds crazy. As I'm hearing you, I actually sense that this is what's really going on. And people start crying. And they're like,
Hmm.
how did you know that? I'm like, well, do you want to know my real answer or do you want
Yeah,
to know
right,
my
right,
diplomatic answer?
right,
Uh,
right.
9 out of 10 times they're like, no, like, how did you know that? I'm like, and we talk about faith a little bit and then we get back into the discussion. But that's the beauty of purpose, right? Is that
Yeah.
purpose is not this mountain type, like you said. It's always this like, hey, in the day to day, mundane, God just shows up.
Yes.
So
I love that, man.
as we finish off, any final words of encouragement for people who are listening to this and they're like, I want to know more about like looking for my purpose, drawing more into intimacy with him and not being
Hmm.
distracted by all these things. Any final words of encouragement?
I would say stay in there. You're not alone. I think that men in particular can be driven to a certain level of belief that they're the only ones facing what they're facing. And that ironically drives us further and further away from the people that I think could help. I just finished a book by Jeff Bethke and John Tyson called Fighting Shadows. I just would highly recommend that. That's a really helpful kind of practical resource for like how do we actually overcome some of these things. But it's geared specifically for men, and it's just a really it's well written, it's practical, but it had some really I think keen insight on, and it did exactly that. We walked through with some of our staff men, and I think even those times have been a good reminder that C.S. Lewis's definition of friendship, right? When you see someone else and you go, "Oh, you too." There's a real gift to knowing, oh, I'm not the only one who's ever had that thought or struggled in this area. And I don't know, I find a lot of strength to keep going, knowing, man, I'm not the first or last person that's ever felt this way. And that when God looks at me, uh, he calls me son. Like, what better thing to be called by the creator of the universe? He's like, yeah, whether you're crushing it or struggling or somewhere in between, you are my beloved son. And to do everything else that I do from that place of belovedness, to me, has been maybe the single greatest shift in my life.
Ian, we're going to leave it there because that is probably the most important, if not the most important thing, right? Like
Mm,
when we come to faith in Jesus, like that we are beloved children of God, it changes everything.
totally.
Awesome. Ian, for those people who are like, man, I love what you're spitting. I love the truth. Tell us, where can we find you and about the bridge?
Sure, man. Yeah, you can go to Bridge TV is our church website. You can go to iansimkins.com or at Ian Simkins on Instagram, or those are two decent places to find me. I think my MySpace is still active if you want to head over there. I probably have a live journal floating around somewhere. Those probably be the two best places to head. Yeah.
I love it, man. Ian, thank you so much for being a part of the podcast. I appreciate the time that we've gotten to know each other and just the wisdom that you've had in really talking about stuff that a lot of the culture doesn't want to talk about right now, especially even in the church. It's all about
Mm,
doing, not about
yeah.
being. So thank you so much for that.
It was my pleasure, man. Thanks for the invite. It means a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. For you men who are listening to this, I want you to take courage that, like everything that Ian was just talking about, is really the foundation to how you help yourself kill shame, stand strong, and be on
Mm.
mission. Until next time, hope you guys have a great day and God bless. Thanks for joining us today. If you found this episode helpful, make sure to subscribe and leave a review. Remember, killing shame isn't just about breaking free from the past. It's about walking boldly into the future God has for you.